is now being recorded.
Welcome to the Respectability webinar, WIOA Implementation, Employment First Planning Tool. Your speakers for today's program are Donna Meltzer, CEO of the National Association of Councils on Developmental Disabilities, NACDD, and Jennifer Mizrahi, President of RespectabilityUSA. Audiocast quality subject to your equipment, available bandwidth, and Internet traffic. If you experience unsatisfactory audio quality, please use the telephone dial-in option providing your confirmation and reminder emails. If you have dialed in, operator assistance is available by pressing #. Missing questions at any time by using the chat window located on the left corner of the presentation screen. A question and answer session will follow the presentation. Handouts for today's program can be downloaded using the program materials link in your confirmation and reminder emails, or from the Documents folder on the lower right corner of the presentation screen. I'll now turn the call over to Jennifer Mizrahi, President of Respectability. Jennifer, please begin.
Thank you all for joining us. We're so delighted to have you to speak today about this toolkit for your WIOA implementation work, especially really geared towards great outcomes for employees with disabilities or potential employees with disabilities. I'm going to kick it off by inviting Donna Meltzer to talk about the role of the National Association of Councils on Developmental Disabilities. She is not only an amazing leader of that organization. For 3 years, she served as a chair of the umbrella arm of all the disability groups nationally. So she has broad experience on everything. So Donna, let me turn it over to you.
Thank you, Jennifer, and hello to everybody who's on the call today. Thank you so much for taking time out of your busy day to be on this really important call. As Jennifer said, I'm Donna Meltzer. I'm CEO of the National Association of Councils on Developmental Disabilities, which is the national organization that serves as the collective voice of the nation's 56 councils on developmental disabilities. Those councils were established by the DD Act more than 50 years ago. As a national organization, we support the work of the DD councils through advocacy and technical assistance to the councils, and we interface regularly with federal partners and other stakeholders so that we can work together to address key issues of our time that affect people with intellectual and developmental disabilities and their families. Councils are in a really perfect place to bring the community together and to affect change and have impact on the lives of people with intellectual and developmental disabilities. One of those key issues that we have been working on is the implementation of the Workforce Innovation and Opportunity Act, or as we call it for short, WIOA. As you all know, it was quite a feat that Congress passed this legislation near the end of the 113th Congress after years of struggle and dissension to find a clear path forward. While the bill was not a perfect piece of legislation, but then again, what is? It does make a bold statement and takes a real step forward to move more individuals, particularly young folks with disabilities, into competitive work and encourages states to put employment of people with all kinds of disabilities as a priority in their state. In that vein, states working together with their governor, the DD Council, other relevant state agencies, and other stakeholders have been working closely with business and industry leaders to build those really important alliances that can support inclusion of people with disabilities into the workplace. Whether it's through an innovative training program that moves students with disabilities from school into a job via a training program like a Project Search, which we know many states have, and we'll be talking a little bit more about that opportunity and that model later, or working with statewide and local business leaders, learning better and figuring out how to better recruit, hire, and retain employees with disabilities. Progress is being made, and you all should be a part of this, which is why you're on this webinar today. Some of you have already been part of calls that are taking place in the states, and others of you might be doing so in the future. I know many of the DD councils have joined in coalition groups throughout the state to meet with the governor, governor's staff, and other stakeholders to really begin these important conversations about how to move forward. Now that WIOA is the law, how does each state pick up from that and move forward with its implementation? Today on this call, we want to give you a flavor of what's being shared with decision makers in all of the states who are working on implementation and to invite your participation in your state. It's my hope that after listening today, you will gain an understanding of the progress that's being made and feel inspired to be part of the process if you are not already. If you've already been part of the process and you're working with your state, perhaps you'll pick up some new ideas and generate some new thoughts for moving forward. So again, I know your time is very precious, and I really want to thank all of you. If you're from a DD Council, I know how hard you've been working, but everybody's been working together so that we can really change the face of what employment for people with all kinds of disabilities looks like across all of our states and territories in the U.S. So thank you again from the bottom of my heart for being part of this call today, for listening in, and we look forward to your participation in the future. Jennifer, I will kick it back to you. I know we've got a lot of slides to go through.
Thank you very much, and thanks again to all who have joined us. As Donna mentioned, we have been meeting with your governors. So our team has met one-on-one with 40 of the governors, and we've spoken with at least representatives of the governors in each of the 50 states. So the material that you're going to hear is the same material, basically, that has been shared with the governors and their teams. We've seen some tremendous progress, and I must say that some of the governors have really done an extraordinary effort. Governor Jack Markell, of course, kicked this off with the Better Bottom Line initiative when he chaired the National Governors Association. But we've also seen really across the board, from Governor Scott Walker in Wisconsin to Governor Bryant in Mississippi, to Governor Dugard in Dakota, to Governor Branstad in Iowa, and all across the country we're seeing very, very exciting progress. Again, all of you who are on this call should be a part of this process because you need to be sure that your opinion is heard, because a big, valuable part of this is stakeholder participation. When we look at the challenges that we're trying to overcome, it's very important to look at the big picture. What are we trying to accomplish? Today in America, 1 out of every 5 Americans has a disability. Amongst working age Americans, there are 21 million Americans who are working age and who have a disability. 70% of those individuals do not have jobs, but most of them want to work. And according to this new WIOA law, which some people call the Opportunity Act, every state legally must produce a unified strategic plan for providing training, employment services, and vocational education in a coordinated way. So that means no longer can much of the workforce system say, hey, you have a disability, we're not going to serve you, go over to vocational rehabilitation. No longer can you have a situation where one-stop shops in American job centers aren't ADA accessible, or the websites with job listings aren't accessible for screen readers or have captions. Everything needs to be integrated, everything needs to be accessible, and we need to help each other. So the workforce agencies and boards, they're going to be dealing with our population, people with disabilities, in many cases for the very first time. Likewise, we need to help them with their work as they try and deal with the fact that this is a lot of new information for them to learn. So it's an opportunity to break down silos, and we want to be sure that as these strategic plans are made, that the funding goes to the things that are going to work. We want to leave the failed practices in the past. We saw a lot of this start, as I mentioned, through the NGA initiative, the Better Bottom Line initiative, through Governor Jack Markell. And that's very fortunate because WIOA is very state-based in how it is being implemented. And we at Respectability, like NACDD, are very lucky to be joined by other partners. The Paralyzed Veterans of America, Best Buddies, NCIL, and NOD are all partners in this national coalition to enable there to be tools for people who want the best outcomes. You can see a link on the website now for the actual toolkit. We've been giving hard copies to the governors, and let us know if you need anything more. But there are also other new developments that are outside of WIOA that are very important. One of which is that 503 has come online to say that all federal contractors should have new opportunities for people with disabilities. 7% of their workers in all job categories, including management, must be people or should be people with disabilities, and we've got 402 for veterans. We also have the new ABLE Act, which also has a new thing that is an opportunity for people. So as we look at the next slide, I want to just show you that these are the people who are supposed to, according to the legislation, be involved in this process. But you really need a lot of stakeholders from workforce development, tax and other incentives, healthcare, transportation, education, vocational rehabilitation, your disability advocates and stakeholders, your employers like the U.S. Business Leadership Network, and the states and others, your federal contractors and state contractors to work together. So it's really critical to break down the silos in terms of the individual players, but also in terms of the funding, because it can be very helpful to really blend and braid funding with things like SNAP, TANF, and other kinds of resources that are trying to get at people who have barriers to work. Young people with disabilities are those who have the best opportunity through this new legislation because, quite honestly, they are the ones that we're seeing the best outcomes with when you do the appropriate supports. Also, we have this new requirement that out-of-school youth need to be a huge part of how you spend your resources. So let's take a special look at them. In America today, there are, according to the U.S. Census, 1.2 million Americans between the ages of 16 and 20 who have disability. So every year, at least 300,000 of them are going into what should be the workforce. Unfortunately, many of them are actually going onto the couch of their parents' home or whoever their caretaker is, many of them never to go into competitive integrated employment. And so that's what we're trying to avoid, is this depression and isolation and poverty from never engaging in integrated competitive employment. And so what we do, those of us who are on this call together, really you control in many ways their destiny as their partners. And so high expectations, eliminating the stigmas and connecting them to effective programs and supports can really enable positive outcomes. You really need to go about this work thinking about it as the win-win-win that it is. The majority of Americans with disabilities who are working age want to work, and that's a talent pool of 20 million potential Americans who can make companies and organizations stronger and better. Number two, hiring people with disabilities can make their employers more successful. Walgreens, EY, AMC, IBM, Pepsi, and others have seen and proven that people with disabilities as employees can be loyal, have better safety records, and be superlative employees. And we have seen that when you do it correctly, particularly when you're focusing on young Americans with disabilities, you can save a lot of money for taxpayers. When we look at slide 8, you can see some of the benefits of hiring people with disabilities. And I just want to point out there's some links there to studies because sometimes people don't believe it. And it's very, very helpful to have actual proof from some of these independent studies. Really, the loyalty of the employees is very important. The safety record, the productivity, this is very important, but it doesn't happen automatically. You have to obviously align people's interests and their abilities with the needs of their employers. Here at Respectability, we call this a Jackie Robinson strategy for integrating the workforce. When you think of the major league sports today, whether it's football or baseball or basketball, we have to remember there was a time when many of these sports were all white. Jackie Robinson was the first African American to integrate Major League Baseball. As a player, he was a superlative player, and he was also a fine human being. And so everybody who was engaged with him found that it was a win-win scenario because they did better as a team, and it was pleasant to work with him. And therefore, it really enabled and inspired the entire league to want to integrate. Now nobody would ever want to go back to a team that was all white. You always want to have the best players on the team so that you can have the best field possible. And so we want exactly the same thing for people with disabilities. There are many superstars with disabilities where you think about, FDR, or you think about Michael J. Fox, or you think about, Albert Einstein's real struggles in school when he was young. But not everyone's going to be, somebody like, Stephen Hawking. What you're going to have to do is find the strengths in every individual and what it is that they can do very successfully. So look in your own communities for your employer heroes. They are EY, which is the best, really, in white-collar, professional, knowledge-based economy, up there with IBM and some others that are really fabulous at including people with disabilities in thought leadership and in really executive leadership. If you look at, Walgreens and Walmart and what's being done in distribution centers, for example, we've got a couple press links here and case studies that I think will help you, but it's very important for you to share some of those successes with the workforce boards and agencies with whom you're partnering, so that if you're a member of a WIOA team in your state, it really behooves you to literally set up a day of field trips and put together a day where you invite the other stakeholders, the other people on the committee, to come and do site visits to some of the best practices in your state. And you may want to, if you work on disability employment, to see what's being done for other populations, whether it's people who are at risk for other reasons, who have other barriers, so that we can really cross-pollinate on best practices and also build trust as we all have to get out of our silos. I'm going to go back to this 503. This is about the federal contractors, and the reason this is so important is you want to be onboarding a lot of talent, and so the talent acquisition strategy has to be into places of employment that frankly have a high capacity of hiring people. So you obviously want companies that are expanding and that are hiring, or have high turnover in, areas like, for example, hospitality, which has very high turnover in their talent management system. But when you look at the federal contractors, not everybody knows who the federal contractors are in your area. Well, lo and behold, a free gift to you, there is a website that lists all federal contractors sorted by congressional district. And so you can find who are the employers in your area that have a 503 requirement to be onboarding talent with disabilities. So these would be potential ideal partners for you in your WIOA implementation, because WIOA money can be spent on apprenticeships and internships and summer jobs, and these kinds of organizations can be good partners. As you look at these federal contractors, a lot of what you will see in many cases are companies that need STEM qualified employees. And so this really argues for yet another partnership with your school system. Why? Because frequently school systems will take young people with disabilities and send them to what they consider like their magnet schools, where they have a strength for working with populations with different disabilities. But frequently we find that the STEM curriculum in those schools is not strong enough. And so you want to be sure that individuals with disabilities are getting the strong academic skills that they need for STEM and other things that are going to be making them competitive. Lockheed Martin, Boeing, General Dynamics, and other federal contractors are looking for STEM employees with or without disabilities, and they're not finding enough STEM qualified people. So you really need to be sure that the kids with disabilities in school are getting the skills that they need for those STEM jobs as well, which again is frequently not happening. When you think of your partners for your WIOA implementation, again, look for the expanding industries and companies. It's especially helpful if they have at least 50 employees each, because then they have more regulations on how they deal with employees, and they always will have an HR person, and that person can be a point person for centralized accommodations and centralized funding for anything that might need to be done in terms of accommodations. You want to look for diverse jobs. Many employers have diverse jobs inside their institutions, like hospitals, senior living communities, big hotels, etc., and they really need to have a market-driven demand, no make-work jobs. It needs to be very successful. The USBLN can be a good partner in finding those local employers that can be right for internships, apprenticeships, and summer jobs with you. The USBLN is a nonprofit organization that represents businesses that really value diversity, particularly amongst people with disabilities. You want to look at the Employment First vision. Now, Employment First is a movement that has existed for a long time, and APSE, amongst others, is at the forefront of this, really saying that the first goal for people with disabilities will be to be in competitive integrated employment. One of the challenges, however, is that this movement has existed for a long time and in many cases has not yet hooked up to the people who are doing the WIOA implementation. I'll give you an example. The state of Arizona, their WIOA committee has already met more than 25 times, and yet the key players in some of the Employment First work have not yet been wrapped in or looped into that work. You want to be sure that whoever the Employment First movement is in your state is sitting on the WIOA implementation committee and showing up at all of the hearings so that we can really make sure that the right leadership is involved. But really, Employment First doesn't start when you're looking for a job. It starts with prenatal counseling. It starts with a strong infant and toddler program. It starts with enabling young people with disabilities when they're in middle school to do community service work. It's IEPs in the school system that really value independence and jobs. And it's those early work opportunities like internships and apprenticeships for teens. If you look at the job and disability data by state, and there's a link to it, you'll find it here. You can really get the breakdown for your state. Now, you're all going to be seeing New York State stats. Again, every single state there's a link to it on our PowerPoint. Actually, let me go back again. You see down here towards the bottom, you see the disability and job data by state. Now, you can link on that later, and you'll find all the information for your state. I'm just going to show you New York State as an example. In New York State, 73% of people without disabilities are in the workforce, but only 32% of those with disabilities. So obviously, you can see the enormous gap. Well, here's something really important, which is that until these data slides were put together, the governors did not understand this, because typically the way governors and workforce boards and agencies see data is they only get the unemployment numbers. And therefore, since many people with disabilities are not currently actively seeking work, they're not reflected in the unemployment data. So all of these millions of people with disabilities who would rather have work were not reflected in their data dashboards or their performance metrics. So it's very important for the governors and the workforce boards and agencies to be sure that workforce participation rate is a key part of their dashboard. That's number one. Number two, they need to be looking very directly at the number of people ages 16 to 20 with a disability, and frankly, the Census Bureau doesn't break it out from 20 to 24. But given the way the funding is under WIOA, that population will be very important to you and basically will double your youth cohort. So you've got this roughly 70,000 young people in New York who are just between the ages of 16 to 20, so you know there's at least 140,000 people who are those young people who are in the process of hopefully going into the workforce. You also see in the state of New York that you've got about 1 million folks who are working age with disabilities. 1 million folks. That's huge. That's almost 1 out of 20 working age Americans with disabilities lives in New York, and you see that 600,000 of them are living on benefits, getting benefits from the government, and yet you're seeing that despite requests for help from 36,000 applications in New York, that Voc Rehab only obtained 12,000 plus jobs. And so that is not the kind of performance metric that we want to see. We obviously want to see Voc Rehab doing at least twice as well And really, by focusing on these best practices, it should not be difficult to literally double your success rate in each of the different states. Now, as I said, we have a big deck of slides for every state, and you should be sure to go all through those slides for your state. I'm only showing you 2 of them. This is the second one I'm going to show you, and it's typically on page 5 of your individual state PowerPoints. But it's very important because you can see what kinds of disabilities people have in your state that are young. What you see in New York is you have a large number of people, almost 9,000 with a visual difference, 7,400 with a hearing difference, 12,500 with an ambulatory difference. Well, you know what? All of those people, for all you know, they might be as smart as Stephen Hawking. They need the right accommodations, they need the right technology, they need the right high expectations so that they can succeed, and they are different than people who have a cognitive disability. Although some people with physical differences might also have a cognitive disability, there is no reason to think that somebody with a visual, hearing, or ambulatory difference should have a lower expectation rate than somebody without a disability in the year 2015. In terms of the cognitive differences, you see this roughly 50,000 young people between the ages of 16 to 20. Right now, we're seeing for people with developmental disabilities, autism, Down syndrome, etc., employment outcomes are about 20%. And if you have 80% of that population living on benefits, and they're young and they're going to be on benefits until they're age 64, the cost to taxpayers is very, very high. But if you look at many programs that are being done, whether it's the Promise program or Bridges to Work or other programs, we're seeing that for populations with an intellectual disability that you can obtain 70% employment outcomes, which is wonderful for those individuals, but they're also great at their jobs, great for the employers. Now, one of the problems that we hear from states is that they don't have enough money to do everything. Well, friends, I want to really sort of put this out on the table. Slide 18 shows you from different states. These are states that literally were given money by the federal government to help people with disabilities get jobs. And because they did not come up with their local match, they gave their money back to the federal government. So you have these states getting millions of dollars. Look at Michigan, $19 million they gave back to the federal government when they could have used it to help people get jobs, and they didn't. And so that's something that every state needs to focus on. I think it's very important to look at the state of Iowa, because Iowa, on this chart, gave back millions of dollars to the federal government. Well, you know what? Governor Branstad now knows the importance of this effort, and he no longer is allowing that to happen. Now, Iowa is getting their full federal match, so they have more support, so they can do the right thing. I'll also point out that this year the state of Wisconsin, because they focused so heavily on doing transition from school to work, and they were so successful in getting people off benefits, that the federal government through the Social Security Administration is going to send them an extra $4 million as a bonus because they got so many people off of benefits because they're so good at getting people with disabilities jobs. Now, I really want to credit the National Governors Association work by Governor Jack Markell for starting all of this, and you can see there's a link on this website to you reading that full report. It really has made a very big difference. Now we're getting to the Disability Employment Planning Tool. Again, this is a partnership with NACDD and Paralyzed Veterans of America, NCIL, NOD, Best Buddies, and ourselves. And you can download the full guide. I'm just going to go through some highlights. But the outline is making the best use of limited resources, finding and supporting businesses in their effort to employ people with disability, and making disability employment part of the state workforce strategy, preparing youth with disabilities for careers that use their full potential, and providing employers with a pipeline of skilled work, and being a model employer by increasing the number of people with disabilities in government work. And now let me just say that this guide really follows what was the recommendations of the National Governors Association report, but we went into best practices. And so the first thing is making sure you have really internal commitment from the top, that the governor and the key leaders, these are people who care about jobs. Almost every governor, when they run for office, they want to be the jobs governor, but they need to understand that that's jobs for people with disabilities too. And one of the best things that you can do is find the best places in your state that are doing a super job on working with people with disabilities. Invite the governors to come and see them for themselves. Invite the governors to bring camera crews in tow. I put some links in along with our team. Some of them will give you some really good ideas on how you can get press or what the best practices are when you look at this. I mean, you really want governors to be putting this in their speeches when they talk to the Chamber of Commerce or they're giving speeches across the state. You want them to be showcasing employing people with disabilities as part of their economic development and jobs plan overall, not just talking to the Amen choir, i.e. Best Buddies or Easter Seals and Goodwill about this topic of employing people with disabilities, but all business leaders across the state and in the media, et cetera, et cetera. So there's a lot of specific examples and ideas that you can see, and I think it's really good to look at some of these webinars. For example, Ernst & Young did a great webinar on best practices, and you can see the link to it here on this PowerPoint. You want to make this strategy of employing people with disabilities part of the whole workforce strategy. Again, the workforce boards and the workforce agencies, they have a major, major role to play on this, and many of them think mistakenly that all they need to do is make sure that the buildings of the one-stop shops are accessible, and that's all they need to worry about, and that there's one person from Voc Rehab that is available in those offices. And that is not the intent of the law. The intent of the law is system-wide integration, getting out of our silos and everybody helping one another. And so you really are going to need to invest time into making sure that people across the whole workforce system understand this, and that the employers understand what a valuable talent asset people with disabilities can be in the success of their companies. There's a number of different links here and how it can be helpful, and I hope that you'll take a look at these on your own time. You can download the PowerPoint and take a look at these links. As you look at the young people on slide 27, you can see that there are many programs, from working with parents in early education, your school to work transitions with your IEPs, et cetera, that are very successful, and you should be investing your money in those programs and not in failed programs. If you wait and invest your money in somebody when they're 40 years old and they've been sitting on a couch for 15 or 20 years with no job experience, no amount of talking to them about changing the font size on their resume is going to make them job ready. The best use of your assets, frankly, is going to be with two populations: young people with disabilities transitioning into the workforce for the first time, number one, and number two, people with previous work experience who have a newly acquired disability due to an accident or a disease, and they have an acquired disability. It's very hard to be successful with people who have a disability and who are long-term unemployed. And if they are long-term unemployed, getting them into an internship and an apprenticeship will be especially important. So let me talk to you for just a few moments about something that's incredibly successful, and we're seeing the vocational rehabilitation agencies across the country are using them. They're in 43 states, and that's the Project Search model. Project Search is really fabulous because what it does is it enables young people with an intellectual disability or social skills differences to spend their last year of school as the first year of the rest of their life. They go to a workshop. Typically it's a hotel, a hospital, or a senior living environment, nursing home, because they have different kinds of jobs. They can work in the kitchen, they can work on grounds, they can work on house cleaning, they can work in administration, and they literally, over the course of the school year, they do 3 different internships. This is different than a shorter-term apprenticeship that is just for one specific job. Those kinds of programs can be very effective, maybe 2 weeks, maybe 40 days of training to go into a particular job. But if that company's job goes away, maybe they figure out how to automate that function and they turn it over to robots or something, do you have somebody with the core competency, the flexibility to change into a different kind of job? You're going to see through a project search program more flexibility and more overall life skills that are prepared, because this is the last year of school typically. The school system is in a partnership with them, sends a teacher through the school system with 10 to a dozen young adults. They are 1 hour a day together learning job skills, resume building, et cetera, and every other hour of the day they're doing actual work for real jobs. 70% of their graduates nationwide are going into competitive integrated employment. Many states are using these, but by and large, they're sort of one-off, or maybe they have 10 of them, and it's not coordinated in one centralized grant. What they've done in Wisconsin, which I believe helped enable them to be getting this extra $4 million from the federal government, is that the state has one contract with Project Search, and therefore they have the performance metrics and the supports all in one centralized way, and it's very, very successful. Again, you have about 70% of their graduates going into jobs, and this is a population that ordinarily only 20% of them would be going into jobs. So it saves quite a lot of money for taxpayers. It also can be used to create programs for out-of-school youth, but in that case, they're not able to take advantage of the school teacher coming from the school system. As you look at the accommodations and the accessibility and the trainings, AskJan.org can give you a lot of help for free. It's a website, it's an online referral service and support center, and obviously the American Job Centers have support. Really, there's a lot of ideas, and you can't forget self-employment and starting your own business and entrepreneurship, which is also important. And there's some good links here that you can take a look at. I want to say that there are a couple of states that are really making an effort to put their material online. So the state of Iowa, for example, Florida, and Delaware are putting a lot of wonderful resources online, and this is really terrifically helpful for those of us around the country that are trying to see what the best practices are, but also for the citizens of that state to understand what is going on in their state. Now, it's very important to become a model employer yourself if you're a government official, so you can be onboarding talent. And we've really, really seen this in Minnesota, in Washington State, and wonderfully in Delaware. Rita Landgraf is doing the best job that I have ever seen in terms of making Delaware an inclusive employer, and we have a lot of links from her office on what they're doing, and she's done a webinar for us, and you can always listen to that webinar and get information there. But there's a lot of ideas in the guide, and you can see these different ideas, and again, there's some great links that you can go to, and you can also look at what best practices are through the USBLN that has some guides on what to do. When you look for talent, really you think of Tapability, because Tapability is a special website for job applicants who have disabilities, and that can be really helpful to government onboarding talent and to these federal contractors that have this new obligation for hiring people with disabilities. And if you're an agency trying to place employees with disabilities, you want to be sure that your job prospects, that your talent pool has their resumes on Tapability, so the federal contractors are going there. Again, there's more ideas for how you can do this and more links. I really urge you to look at them. So take a look at some of the state data, take a look at the data on our website, the state-by-state data that I mentioned, There's some other ideas and links here, whether it's Ask Jan or Tapability or your state VR agency. There's a lot of people who want to help. You do not have to reinvent the wheel as you go to this. Now, our next webinar is going to be on May 21st, which is the National Day for Website Accessibility, and we're going to be talking about website accessibility. So if you have a website, please forward the invitation to the person or persons in your office that work on it to make sure that your website are screen reader accessible and also for other disabilities like captions on videos, etc. But we're going to turn it over to questions from the operator. You can do that via the phone. Operator, do you want to explain how people can put their comments in? I see there's some questions which I'll start to read, but we're now very interested in questions.
Will do, Jennifer. Ladies and gentlemen, for those of you who have dialed in, you can press 7 followed by the pound sign on your phone now to queue up for verbal questions. Again, 7 pound to ask for questions over the phone or submit them via chat.
So as people are starting to put in your questions, I see that there's a question about sub-minimum wage. Really, the way that WIOA goes now is that young people going into the workforce for the first time should not be put into sheltered workshops, especially if they're sub-minimum wage. Really, it's all about competitive integrated employment, and that's very important. And so programs like Project Search or the Bridges program, the Promise program, these are very, very successful programs, and actually we're going to be doing webinars on those programs, particularly because they're so successful. But it is really quite important that young people are going into competitive integrated employment. And then there's a question about, really prospects for people going into employment who aren't kids or young adults. And yes, this is an important thing that your one-stop shops, your American Job Centers are accessible, and that also you are really doing early intervention for people who are developing through disease or accident, a new disability, but who have some previous work experience. For those who are long-term unemployed, it's really important to have some sort of apprenticeship or internship opportunity that's going to give them the soft skills and really the practice of getting up in the morning, getting their clothes on, looking professional, listening to a boss, doing what they need to do so that they can be successful. Joan R. asked, many current service providers for Massachusetts and DVR are also operators of sub-minimum wage facilities. Is there no conflict of interest? Do you want to say something about that, Donna, at all?
Just checking that I'm off mute. So I think that, hold on, I'm just pulling up the question so I can read it again. And I don't know if Joanna can continue to type in. I was a little confused, and I want to make sure that I answer the question correctly. I think, Joanna, what you're trying to get at is to say, how do we, and maybe you're somebody who works for this state, you want to make sure that you're doing everything right and providing the right kind of opportunities and making sure, when you talk about conflict of interest, that's the part that I'm not quite sure what you're saying, but making sure that you are not approving maybe a business or a work opportunity that has a 14C certificate. I think that's the question that you're asking, and I think that, comes back to working collaboratively and making sure that you're bringing all the right people to the table to have these conversations. There's certainly a movement to move away from sub-minimum wage facilities, and that's part of what WIOA is all about, is to recognize that some facilities are going to continue to exist, but we're looking toward change and we're looking for better opportunities that can exist in the future. And that kind of goes back to Mark's question as well about, is WIOA making a difference just for young kids and young adults, or are we really helping to promote more opportunities for maybe middle-aged adults, or as you said, Jennifer, those who are long-term unemployed? First of all, it's a little too soon to know what impact WIOA will have because it's brand new legislation, and as we were discussing in today's call, this is the first states are first looking at implementation, and regulations are first being written and will be available soon for everybody to really chew on. But I think what we're really trying to share in this webinar opportunity is there are so many great opportunities and ways to connect in your state. DD councils, along with Respectability and Best Buddies and Nickel and others, are working with governors, with their staff. And as I said at the beginning, councils also play that very unique and wonderful role to bring a lot of stakeholders to the table for discussion, to partner with businesses, and to really put forward those best practices. Jennifer highlighted Project Search. Many councils support Project Search initiatives in their states, but there are a lot of other programs that are very similar to the Project Search model and may be more for adults. For example, in the state of Maryland, there's a bakery in a particular county in Maryland where individuals can apply to become a student and learn the trade of being a baker. It is not age specific, but anybody can, who has a cognitive or developmental disability can be part of this very high level training. They come out with a trade, and then the organization helps place them into a bakery that is in the county. Some of them are through major grocery store chains, others are private businesses. They've now expanded to open a cafe where all of the employees are individuals with developmental disabilities, and they are learning the business of how to operate the business with the idea that if they get their training in that cafe, they can then go off and have jobs in others. So those opportunities are not relegated only to young kids coming out of school or young adults, but I think for individuals of any age.
Right, and there's a very important question about the state of California and getting the state of California to adopt employment first legislation. So I'm going to make what may be a surprising comment to some of you, but I think it's really important observation now that we have looked at the data and met with 40 of the governors, and that is that for a long time the employment first movement really thought that employment first legislation was going to yield a better outcome for employment for people with disabilities. And what I see, for example, if you look at the state of Maine has terrific legislation that is on the books in terms of employment first, but their employment outcomes are terrible. They're just terrible. So the question is, why is it that you have model legislation in Maine but terrible outcomes? It's because the legislation is what I call necessary but not sufficient. Here's an analogy. Think about a train that operates on a steam engine. A steam engine only works when the water gets to a boiling point, which is at 212 degrees. Let's imagine that you've got a little space heater next to the water and you're able to get that water up to 60 degrees or 100 degrees or 210 degrees. And the water's is simmering at 210 degrees, but you know what? It's not boiling and creating any steam until it's 212 degrees. So this is the difference between necessary and sufficient. There are a lot of pieces in the employment toolkit that we have just given you. If you only do some of them, it will be like the steam engine that isn't moving anywhere because the water's getting a little bit warmer, but all the pieces are not integrated together. So what are those integrated pieces? The integrated pieces, yes, employment first legislation can be very helpful, but if there's legislation on the books that the government should do something, but they're sending their money back to the federal government because they're not doing their local match, and so they're like the state of Michigan sending $19 million back to the federal government so that Voc Rehab doesn't have the job coaches that they need. It's, you've done some necessary work, but not not sufficient work. If you take a look at, when you think about the employers, if you find a great employer, but that employer has no transportation that's coming to it, well, it's necessary to have an employer that wants to hire talent, but it's not sufficient. I was just at a very important hearing recently at the Department of Labor on WIOA implementation. One of the top companies, Walgreens, which is a wonderful employer, a model employer of people with disabilities in South Carolina, literally took the time, energy, and money to train 600 people to go into retail. 600 people with disabilities were trained to go into retail, but the local agencies only came up with the job coaches and the job supports for 160 of them. So you had 600 people who competed mightily to get the job training, which was a 4-week program. You had the investment of the time and money to train those 600 people, and then you had over 400 people who competed to get trained, spent 4 weeks getting trained, being told, you know what, we don't have job coaches for you. And so when you take a look at this toolkit, you have to look at all these different pieces and think about how it comes together. I was at a major conference on homelessness and housing. So when you think of the workforce integration policy now, keep in mind that the people who are dealing with finding jobs for young people with young people who are homeless, keep in mind that 40% of young Americans who are homeless that are in this job category of dislocated youth under the age of 24, they're also from the LGBTQ community, so they have gender orientation issues. They've largely been thrown out of their homes by their family who was not accepting who they were. So they've got these other layers, and they may have disabilities on top of those layers. So just simply getting the Employment First legislation is not going to be enough. Again, it's necessary, but not sufficient. The state of California in particular, I do not know why, but Governor Brown does not seem to be particularly interested or engaged in these issues. If I was to look at the top governors around the country, the people who could make a really big difference, clearly the state of California is very high on the list, because you have very poor performance metrics. And indeed, if you look at their public school system, literally 80 of the public schools in Florida have a license to be involved in sheltered workshops with sub-minimum wage. And that is not what we want to be seeing at 80 or any public school systems there. So that's very important. So I went on that. Donna, do you see the question?
I'd like to address, I think it was Robert had a question about how do we instigate more opportunities for employment for people who are at a higher level. We talked about things like Project Search and similar opportunities which are for people with more significant cognitive disabilities. I think that there are a lot of opportunities that are going on for folks at the higher level, and I think one of the biggest issues, Robert, that we're grappling with around that is getting that information out. Jennifer highlighted in these slides a lot of big businesses that are hiring at larger rates, and they're hiring very capable people with higher degrees. For example, I received a phone call one day from somebody in the HR department of Deloitte, which is a major accounting firm known nationwide, and she said, we're really struggling to hire. She said, we want to hire lots and lots of people with disabilities, all kinds of disabilities, and we don't seem to be getting the applicants. And so I engaged in a conversation with her about that, and it was very similar to some conversations that took place earlier this winter at the White House when there was a summit on employment, that one of the things that we're not doing well is getting information out into the hands of individuals who have all kinds of disabilities about where the best opportunities are. And in fact, in a discussion with Vice President Biden last year, we kind of had the same conversation too, and he literally said, I think the problem is not that we don't have a ready workforce and a pipeline of individuals with disabilities at all levels, And it's not that we don't have jobs available. We have both. A big part of what we don't have is the right system to match the right people with the right employment. And I think that that's a key piece of this. And I don't have a fantastic answer for you other than to say we all need to do better at sharing information. I know the federal government, one of our suggestions to them was to make one easy, accessible website where people can find information about employment instead of having to go to 5 or 6 different websites to find out where are their jobs, what should I be thinking about, what should I be prepared for in applying. Clearly there are still issues around application processes in terms of getting through interviews, but I think that there are jobs out there, and then some of it has to come down to customized employment opportunities at the local level. We've been working, Jennifer, I know, has been working a lot with CSAVR, the voc rehab folks, and really trying to see how we can do better in terms of making good matches, really honoring the wishes and desires and talents of individuals with disabilities. I sometimes fear that what happens in local areas is, we hear about the very big companies, but they might not be in your town, or we hear about the smaller, very customized opportunities, but that might not be right for you. Most of us are somewhere in the middle. We're looking to work at employers in our local towns where we have the right talent that we can deliver well on the job. But there are still some barriers. We're sorting through that, and we are trying to figure out what those barriers are so that we can begin to address them one by one.
Right, and there's a question here about advanced education, and so I want to talk about how the governors feel about this as we're meeting with the governors and the workforce boards. So the governors and workforce boards are incredibly frustrated with higher education. Here's why. To some extent, I think that they perceive that a lot of higher education is really a scam. And what do I mean by saying that? Because, you look at higher education and people think, oh, you go to college, it's a ticket to success. But the problem is, what if you go to college and you don't graduate? What if you go to college and you don't study something that's practical? What we're seeing is that huge numbers of Americans are taking out student loans that they cannot afford to go to college, and then they do not complete their degree. Or they complete a degree in a field that there's no market for. And so what the governors are trying to do is really shift a lot to focusing on community colleges and trade schools. Seeing what are the actual labor force demands in an area, that if you have a company that says, hey, we're going to need workers to do A, B, and C. And by the way, even manufacturing has become fairly complicated, and you need, in many cases, to have some STEM qualifications to do even manufacturing jobs in today's world. So they want to see the use of, these apprenticeships and these kind of degrees you can get at a community college in computer science or in a beauty school or in all kinds of different trades to be a plumber or whatever. And so that's something that they're really, really looking at. And also there's a lot of assisted technology to help now in terms of just apps on people's phones to get them to show up for class. This is a huge problem. If you have somebody with executive function disorder and they're not showing up in class and going to the class, they literally get an alert that says my kid's cell phone did not show up in the classroom, my kid is not going to class, I'm paying a bunch of money, my kid's taking out a huge loan, and yet they're not showing up at class. This is a huge problem that we're seeing, that young people are going to college for 6 years, coming out with no degree, and this is a problem. Also, another problem is that sometimes through IEPs, the incentives are the wrong incentives. What do I mean by that? The way that school teachers are largely graded, and we've seen this in Atlanta where 7 school teachers are going to jail because they holistically cheated so that their kids would get better test scores because the teacher's raise and pay was linked to test scores. Very much for kids with disabilities, there's an incentive for kids to get higher test scores. So in many cases, we see in IEPs that the kids are given accommodations that they should not be given. They're given too much time on a test. You know, oh, you've got a disability, we'll give you double time on a test. Oh, you've got a disability, you can use a scribe on tests. Oh, you've got a disability, you can use a calculator. Well, what does that do? That gives the young person with a disability the ability to have the higher GPA, which means that the teacher can get the raise or the promotion that they want. But when that young person goes into the job and the employer doesn't give them double time to do their work, they're not as well prepared. And so it's very important to look at this whole thing, you know, this theory of change holistically. Again, let's look at that steam engine and see, are we getting to the 212 degrees so the water boils and the engine moves, or are we only getting part of the way? So we have to really look at this kind of holistically. Donna, do you want to take the next one?
If I'm correct, the next one is Stephen, who's written about being frustrated about contacting local legislators and feels that nothing is happening for people with disabilities. Stephen, what I'd like to say to you is hang in there and keep at it. You know, the art of advocacy is not something that happens quickly, easily, overnight. It's something that we continue to do and must do over and over, and then keep rethinking our tactics. And if you're not making progress, or you feel your message is not being heard, what else can you do to make sure that it is heard? Are you talking to the right people? If you're seeing the right people but they're not hearing your message, who else can you bring in that they might listen to in a different way? Who else can join you for those visits with legislators? Or who else can you get to send in a letter or meet and greet the legislator? Are you taking your legislator out into the community to see, live the life of your life for the day or the life of somebody else you know? The Wisconsin Board for People with DD, which is the Wisconsin CD Council, has a great program called Take Your Legislator to Work Day. And they have this organized event each year where they bring legislators out to work side by side in the community and with people with developmental disabilities so they can really see firsthand what is it like. So my message to you is don't give up. It takes a long time. Good legislation and good change doesn't come easily, and it doesn't come quickly. So use all of the tools in your toolbox. We've certainly given you some today, and I encourage you to work collaboratively with other organizations and other advocates in your state or in your local area, and to keep at it and figure out who is your legislator tied to, who does he or she really listen to if he or she is not listening to you, and bring those voices together for the greater good.
Right, and Jordan is asking, you know, in Michigan where he lives, he wants to know what's the first thing that he can do. I'm trying to find, going back on the slides, to really finding the state link. It's really important that you get your state link to get the download of what's the data for your state. Here it's on this page on slide 15. There's a link to all the states. So pull down the actual statistics. Make sure that your governor and workforce boards know the workforce participation levels, not just the unemployment levels of people with disabilities. Let them understand how many people demographically are in your state that this impacts, because it's 1 out of every 5 Americans, and people frequently don't realize that. In the state of Michigan, the lieutenant governor is the best addressed. The lieutenant governor there is very interested in this issue because he has a family member with a disability. And that's not uncommon, since 1 out of every 5 Americans has a disability. Governors generally have a family member with a disability. Some governors themselves have disability. Governor Hickenlooper in Colorado is significantly dyslexic. Governor Dan Malloy in Connecticut, which, by the way, Connecticut, their USBLN really wants to be helpful, but Malloy has a learning disabilities. And, you know, when he was a kid, people said that he was never going to make it because his learning differences were so significant. If you look at the governor of Alabama, he has a child with developmental disabilities. The governor of North Carolina has a son who's legally blind, but who graduated Harvard Law School and is now working at the Bank of America. You look at the governor of New Mexico, who has a sister with very significant disabilities who lives with her, and she is the primary caretaker for her adult sister with a disability, who she generally takes to work with her on many days at the State House. And so, you know, these are not issues that are completely foreign to all these leaders, because they, in many cases, have a family member or they know somebody who they care about who has a disability, and help them get into that person's shoes, help them see that they have abilities, that they can be very successful when they have the right accommodations and supports. And, you know, really, assisted technology and accommodations can be very, very important for people with newly acquired disabilities, for example, you know, vision, hearing, chronic pain, etc. Those sorts of issues can be very helpful. Operator, were there any phone calls that people were holding on the phone with a call?
We had one from Sharon, but she removed herself from queue. Sharon, if you want to ask a question again, please press 7# on your phone now.
While we're waiting, I want to go back and address one other thing with education and about advanced degrees. I do think that getting a true high school diploma and further, you know, higher education, if that's right for you, certainly are worthwhile endeavors, and there are more and more opportunities being made available now for individuals, especially those with developmental disabilities, to move into higher education as did not exist previously. But I know a lot of DD councils, along with many other disability organizations in the states, are really working to ensure that kids who graduate high school do graduate with a real diploma. Whether or not you consider higher education, leaving school with a real diploma makes a huge difference in terms of your opportunities for meaningful employment. I've heard from too many families where, you know, they did feel like their son or daughter spent enough years in school and they just wanted them to get through, and walked away with a diploma, and either they gave up the opportunity to have a real diploma or did not even know that their child was not receiving a real diploma, and that did not become apparent until their son or daughter went to apply for jobs and found out that it was not, in fact, the same diploma that other students were receiving. And so we really are working through councils, through the state departments of education, as well as through current legislation on the Hill, like the ESEA, the Elementary and Secondary Education Act, to ensure that all students can graduate with a real diploma. So I do think that getting that opportunity for a great education is very important and has a huge impact in terms of moving forward with your employment.
Right, and so Kelly M. writes that she's part of SELN in Montana and presented some information to the governor. So here's the thing. If you have information that you're presenting to your governors or to your WIOA implementation teams, we want to know about it, because we want to be a clearinghouse of best practices. If your state has figured out how to do something well, or if you've got an employer who's really great at doing this, who should be highlighted, we want to know. As we went through our PowerPoint today, you see there's all these suggestions. We would have liked to have had for you a link to a best practice in every single one of those items, and we didn't because we don't know enough yet about what's going on around the country. So everybody who's on this call, if you've got something fabulous happening in your backyard, please email me. It's jenniferm@respectabilityusa.org. You know, if you think there should be a webinar on something because you don't know how to do something and it's really important to your state, you'll let us know. Or if you have problems or challenges, or you don't know who the right person is who's working on it in your state, this is our job. We are here to be a resource to help you. But really, these governors are working on these policies, and in many cases, they have never, ever, ever been invited to come see a place where people with disabilities are succeeding in competitive integrated employment. They love to come. They love to learn about it. They love to bring press in tow. If you can think through this, what are the most important things? Who are the expanding employers who are hiring, who are on public transportation? Better yet, do they happen to be federal contractors? Great. Can you get a meeting with them and see if they'll be a part of your WIOA implementation plan so you can set up proactively, intentionally, an internship program, an apprenticeship program that you can onboard significant number of talent. I'll mention the state of Arkansas, for example. We just met recently, or fairly recently, with the governor of Arkansas. He's newly elected, and he pulled together about 40 people in a room. It was all the different relevant agencies from across Arkansas, and you know who else was joining on that? Walmart. Why is that important? Important because Walmart has 53,000 employees in the state of Arkansas. And not only are they important in Arkansas, they are literally the largest employer in 43 of America's 50 states. They hire 500,000 employees a year. So the question is, if you're in one of the 43 states where Walmart is your largest employer, do you have a relationship with them? Because you know what? Walmart's really interested in being model employer for people with disabilities, particularly if they're veterans. And so what kind of relationship and partnership do you have with them? It's very important for you to think about this in large numbers because we want to get large numbers of people involved. So I do like the idea of customized employment in cases where that's the only avenue, but the workforce system is really geared to going to where the talent needs are in the market economy. Who are the employers who are hiring? What are the talent needs that they have? How do we be sure that our talent, people with disabilities, are well prepared for those jobs, STEM jobs or otherwise? How can we make sure that they have the high expectations that they need starting when they're very young, that we're working with their parents when they're 14 and perhaps as early as the infant and toddler program? So again, this is about doing not just what's necessary, but what's sufficient. Think again of that steam engine. What are all the different pieces that need to come together to make this successful? I think you'll find if you go through this PowerPoint very carefully, feel free to ask us any questions that you have, that when you put all of this together, that there's not a single state in America that can't, within a short order, I mean in the next 3 years, double their performance metrics in terms of helping people with disabilities get jobs, at least double the number of individuals that are getting jobs through their vocational rehab. Because really, when you focus your spending on these kinds of programs and systems that work, you'll be able to get very, very high outcomes. Now, unfortunately, we've run out of time, but I want to thank my partner in this, Donna Meltzer, and her entire organization for the fabulous work that they're doing, not only on this project, but every other project. I want to thank the 50 DD directors around the country who are terrific partners on this, and our other partners through Paralyzed Veterans of America, NOD, Best Buddies, the Independent Living Movement, and our other partners on this for the fabulous work that they're doing. And I also want to thank, the governor's offices, the workforce boards and agencies, the VOC Rehab that are doing terrific jobs. There are many governors and states doing extraordinary work. In fact, today we're doing site visits out in Nevada to Pepsi and to Office Depot. We love to do site visits to best practices. So let us know if you've got places that we can come and visit. We're going to start a PR campaign that's going to be about best practices, and we'd love to have you be a star in it. So let us know what's going on. Thank you again for dialing in and being a part of this. If you have any questions, please don't hesitate to let us know. And once again, our next webinar is on the 21st, and it's on website accessibility. So let the person who does your website know about it, and we look forward very much to being in touch. Thank you again.
Ladies and gentlemen, this concludes today's Respectability webinar. Thank you all for attending.
The moderator has ended the conference. Goodbye.